When Nolan Vance walked into the VIP room at Blackthorn Crown wearing a grease-stained mechanic's uniform, the entire table laughed. Vivian Blackthorn, the coldest casino queen in Las Vegas, deliberately tossed him a $1 chip and told him to learn how to lose like the poor man he was. Nolan didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed a worn copper coin bearing the Blackthorn crest onto the felt and requested a single game. Vivian smiled, signed the terms in front of 100 witnesses, and 3 hours later she had lost everything her father ever built. If you want to watch the most humiliated man in the room take back an empire, stay until the final hand. Nolan Vance lived behind a 2-bay garage on the east side of Henderson, Nevada, in a converted office that smelled of machine oil and old coffee, and just enough home-cooked breakfast to remind him every morning that he still had something worth staying for. He was 42 years old, and most people who met him assumed he was somewhere between a handyman and a forgotten man. Quiet, deliberate, wearing the same worn canvas jacket he had owned for a decade, with grease underneath his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing fully removed. His daughter Harper, 17 and sharper than anyone who had ever underestimated her, had learned early that her father was not the kind of man who explained himself to people who had already decided what he was. Nolan ran Vance Restoration out of that garage, a meticulous operation specializing in antique vehicles, mechanical casino tables, and precision equipment that no one else in Nevada bothered to learn how to fix anymore. The work suited him. It required patience, an eye for systems, and the discipline to know when something had been built wrong from the inside. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, inside an envelope bearing the return address of the estate management office of Gideon Blackthorn. Nolan recognized the name the way a man recognizes the sound of his own past, not with surprise, but with the complicated weight of something that had never been fully set down. Inside he found 3 things: a worn copper coin engraved on one side with a crown and the letters BC, a keycard to the VIP floor of Blackthorn Crown Resort and Casino, and a single handwritten note in Gideon's angular script that read, "Come before Vivian sells what she never truly owned." Nolan read the note twice, set the coin on the bench beside a half-rebuilt ratchet, and stood very still for a long moment, because Gideon Blackthorn had been dead for 6 months, which meant this letter had been prepared and held in trust, and Gideon had always been precise about timing. That same evening, Blackthorn Crown was hosting its annual Summit Gala, designed to announce a $4 billion partnership with Ashcroft Capital, a deal that would position the resort conglomerate as the dominant gaming brand in 3 western states. Before leaving, Nolan replaced a cracked bracket on the truck Harper had been learning to drive, promised her he would be back before the sun came up, and declined her offer to help him pick a better shirt. He was not going to the gala. He was going to deliver a coin and a warning to a woman he had never met, and he saw no reason to dress for an occasion he hadn't been invited to. When he arrived at Blackthorn Crown, 2 members of the security team looked at his uniform and directed him toward the service entrance without asking his name. Nolan followed the service corridor the way someone follows a path they helped design. Not because a sign told him which way to turn, but because he had seen the blueprints, the camera positions, the magnetic lock sequence, the ventilation routing, the placement of the backup power switches. All of it matched. With only minor cosmetic updates, the system he had drafted in collaboration with Gideon 20 years earlier when Blackthorn Crown was still a single building on the edge of the Strip. He noticed a secondary authentication layer added to the electronic table system and paused 3 seconds to understand its purpose before continuing. When the door to the main VIP lounge swung open, Nolan saw, across a room full of crystalware and tailored jackets, and the practiced laughter of people who had never once worried about a utility bill, a man he recognized, Felix Ashcroft, silver-haired and immaculate, laying an open contract folder in front of Vivienne Blackthorne while a cluster of attorneys hovered at a respectful distance. The room held perhaps 80 guests, distributed across banquet seating and cocktail stations with the choreographed ease of people who had attended this kind of event so many times it had become a second language. Vivienne Blackthorne stood at the center of it, all the way a chandelier stands at the center of a room, not because she needed to be noticed, but because the architecture arranged itself around her. She was 36, precise in everything from her posture to her phrasing, and she wore authority the way other women wore jewelry, deliberately, and with the expectation that it would be recognized. Nolan moved toward her and had made it within 15 feet before a floor manager in a charcoal blazer stepped into his path and asked, quietly but firmly, what his business was. Nolan said he was there on behalf of Gideon Blackthorne, and the name carried through the room the way a stone carries through still water, in widening rings, and within seconds, Vivienne had turned to look at him with the cool patience of someone deciding whether a problem is worth engaging or simply dismissing. Grant Wexler, the company's chief financial officer, leaned close to her ear and said something too low for anyone else to hear, and whatever it was made her posture relax almost imperceptibly. Vivienne took 2 steps forward and looked at Nolan the way she might look at a delivery driver who had wandered into the wrong building, not with cruelty exactly, but with the particular indifference that is sometimes harder to bear. She said she was not aware her father had scheduled a maintenance call for this evening, and a ripple of quiet laughter moved through the nearest guests. When Nolan said he had come with something belonging to this building and reached into his jacket pocket, Wexler suggested the gentleman's personal belongings should be inventoried first, for the safety of the guests, and Vivienne agreed. The inventory, conducted in full view of everyone present, produced an old phone with a cracked screen, a key ring, a wallet containing $112 in cash, 2 insurance cards, and a small photograph tucked behind the driver's license. A woman with light eyes and an easy laugh, standing next to a girl who could only be Harper, taken some time before illness, had made easy laughter harder to find. There was also the copper coin. One of the security team held it toward Vivienne with the mild air of someone presenting evidence that had failed to be interesting. Vivienne looked at it briefly, glanced at Wexler, and then reached into her own jacket pocket and produced a single $1 gaming chip from Blackthorn Crown, which she placed into Nolan's palm with a slow deliberateness that made certain the entire room was watching. She said she considered it the most significant investment a Blackthorn had ever extended to someone of his station, and that he was welcome to take it to any table on the main floor where he might learn the house rules. Felix Ashcroft asked Nolan whether he actually knew how to play cards or had simply come to admire the felt, and the room received this with the warm approval of a crowd that has just seen exactly what it expected. Nolan closed his fingers around the chip and said nothing. He looked at Vivienne with the measured stillness of a man who was deciding, not reacting, and then asked her, quietly enough that the room had to lean in slightly, whether she was truly confident that the partnership she was about to announce would leave her in control of the company her father built. Vivienne told him that men who lived in garages did not have standing to advise women who ran billion-dollar resorts. Nolan nodded, reached into his shirt pocket, and set the copper coin flat on the nearest table. Eleanor Price, Blackthorn Crown's general counsel, who had been standing near the back of the room with the expression of someone watching a car approach an intersection from 2 directions simultaneously, went visibly pale and crossed the room in 11 steps. Eleanor pushed between Nolan and Vivienne with the quiet authority of a person who understood exactly what she was looking at and why it changed everything. She asked Vivienne to stop the proceedings, and when Vivienne began to object, Eleanor said the words, "Founder's Crown Marker," with the careful pronunciation of someone reading from a document they had memorized specifically because they hoped never to have to use it. The room produced a different kind of silence. Not the entertained quiet of people watching a spectacle, but the held-breath stillness of people who could feel the weight of something shifting. Eleanor explained that Gideon Blackthorne had written into the original company charter a provision called the Crown Table Challenge, created after a near-catastrophic betrayal by an early investor in the company's second year, when the casino had nearly been stolen through a fraudulent share transfer. The provision established that the bearer of a founder's crown marker retained the right to demand a review of any pending acquisition agreement, to request access to the company's financial records, or to challenge the current controlling shareholder in a supervised contest governed by the original table rules. Eleanor held up the coin and showed the room the serial engraving on the back edge, a number and a crown and lock seal matching the description in the original charter document, which she had photographed and stored for exactly this kind of occasion. Vivian turned to Wexler, who wore the expression of a man watching a chess piece move to a square he had told himself was impossible, and Wexler said the provision was almost certainly obsolete. Eleanor said it was not. Nolan let Eleanor finish before he spoke, and when he did, his tone was the same unhurried calm he had used since walking in. The voice of a man who was not performing patience but had trained himself over many years to understand that urgency is a tool other people use against you. He said he had not come to play cards or to claim ownership of anything that night, and he asked Vivian to delay the signing of the Ashcroft Agreement for 48 hours. Just long enough for an independent audit of the financial instruments attached to the deal. Vivian said she would not take scheduling instructions from a man who arrived at a black tie event in a uniform with another company's logo on the chest. Eleanor opened the archived governance records on her device and spoke for 30 seconds. And what she said produced a silence of the kind that only arrives when a fact lands that cannot be argued with. The Vance Founding Trust, incorporated in the state of Nevada, held 34% of the founding shares of Blackthorne Crown Resorts, shares that had never been sold, never been transferred, and never been publicly disclosed because the original shareholder agreement had included a privacy clause that both parties agreed to honor for as long as Nolan chose not to exercise his governance rights. Nolan had designed the original risk management architecture for the casino floor, had discovered and neutralized a fraudulent accounting scheme in year 3 that would have resulted in regulatory closure, and had negotiated the licensing agreements that allowed Blackthorne Crown to expand into 2 additional states, all without a title, without a press release, and without ever asking Gideon to acknowledge his contribution publicly, because Nolan had never wanted recognition. He had wanted the system to work. He had left the company 17 years ago and placed his voting rights in trust with Gideon, and he had never come back, because he had a wife to care for and then a daughter to raise, and he had chosen both over every return flight he was offered. Vivian did not say anything for a long moment. The information was not simply new. It was a structural revision to a story she had believed her entire adult life, and she could feel the walls of that story flexing under it. She had grown up knowing her father as the architect of everything around her, and she had assumed the foundation was entirely his because no one had ever told her otherwise. Wexler recovered first, saying smoothly that this was clearly a complicated situation, and that perhaps the evening was not the right venue for resolving questions of corporate governance dormant for nearly 2 decades. Vivian looked at Nolan with the cold, controlled expression of a woman who had decided that if she could not yet absorb the information, she could at least determine what to do about the man who had brought it. She told him that if he had truly helped build what stood around them, He could prove it by surviving at the table it had produced. Nolan said no. He said it without apology, without theatrical humility, and without the upward inflection that signals a person is hoping the other side will argue them into changing their answer. He repeated his request. 48 hours, an independent auditor, and a postponement of the Ashcroft signing. Felix Ashcroft laughed with the practiced ease of a man who had conducted enough hostile negotiations to recognize a retreat dressed up as principle, and he observed that poor men tend to develop a sudden enthusiasm for due process when they realize they are about to lose the one bluff they were holding. Wexler positioned himself close enough to Vivian's ear that the words he spoke were technically private, but his body language was entirely legible to Nolan from across the room. He watched Wexler's shoulders angle toward her, watched the slight tilt of her head that meant she was receiving information she had not already considered, and watched her expression migrate from controlled irritation to something sharper and more dangerous. If she secured Nolan's 34% in a single supervised contest, she would hold enough combined voting power to ratify any agreement without opposition, and would do it in front of witnesses who would carry the story into every investor meeting and industry conference for the next 5 years. The Casino Queen had never lost a public challenge. Wexler knew this. He was counting on it. Vivian proposed a wager structured around the Crown Table Challenge framework. She would place her entire 52% controlling interest against his 34% founding stake, to be settled in a 3-stage supervised game: blackjack, baccarat, and a final poker round, with Eleanor serving as independent legal witness. The loser would surrender their shares, vacate their board position, and relinquish all claim to operational control with no right of legal challenge to the outcome. Eleanor objected, clearly and without diplomatic softening, that this was not a poker game. It was a corporate transfer agreement denominated in billions of dollars, dressed in the language of a bet. Vivian said Eleanor had noted her concerns for the record and thanked her. Vivian then looked at Nolan and told him that he had walked away from a boardroom and traded it for a garage, that he had exchanged stock certificates for tuition invoices, and that he did not have standing to stand in a building like this and pretend that years of absence could be redeemed in a single evening by producing a coin from his shirt pocket. The room absorbed this the way rooms absorb cruelty when phrased elegantly enough to sound like a verdict. Nolan was very still. Across the room, the floor manager Wexler had been communicating with throughout the evening had his hand resting near the VIP table console, and Nolan noticed, not because he was looking for it, but because he had designed the system it controlled, and he knew what a person looked like when they were holding a remote switch they intended to use. Nolan accepted the challenge on 2 conditions. The match would be fully recorded on the resort's own security system, with Eleanor holding access to the footage, and Eleanor would have supervisory authority over all procedural decisions. Vivian agreed immediately, with the ease of someone who had been told the game was already arranged. Nolan picked up the $1 chip Vivian had given him and placed it at the edge of the table as his opening marker. The Crown Table had been in place since the resort's original construction, a dedicated high-stakes space with a single overhead camera, a soundproof glass surround, and a gaming surface that had been refelted more times than anyone still working at the property could remember. The 3-stage format began with blackjack, moved into a limited baccarat round, and culminated in a heads-up poker session that would determine the final outcome. Approximately 60 guests crowded the glass perimeter, and Felix Ashcroft positioned himself at the corner of the room with the studied relaxation of a man who had attended the closing ceremony of something already decided. Nolan lost the first blackjack hand badly, splitting a pair when conventional strategy said to stand, and watching Vivienne take the round with the clean efficiency of a woman who had been playing this game since she was old enough to sit at a table. The room reacted the way it had been reacting to Nolan all evening, with a warmth that was not warmth at all, but the comfortable pleasure of watching a prediction come true. Vivienne placed the $1 chip on the edge of the table in front of Nolan and suggested he stop now, before the evening cost him more than a garage could recover from. Nolan looked at the chip and looked at Vivienne, and there was nothing in his face that confirmed he was troubled. He had the expression of a man who is calculating, not a man who is defeated, and to anyone who had learned to read the difference, it was notable. The second round, a baccarat sequence with strict betting limits, went no better for him on the surface. He made choices that seemed impulsive, passed on obvious plays, and ended the round giving Vivienne a significant overall advantage. Wexler visibly relaxed, leaning against the glass partition with the posture of a man watching the final minutes of a game whose outcome he already knew, and Felix Ashcroft asked his assistant to begin drafting a statement about the resolution of the founding share dispute. Vivienne used the interval to say things designed to settle into the room as established fact. That Nolan had walked away from the company when it needed people who stayed, that Gideon's affection for him had been genuine, but that affection and equity were two separate things. Each observation landed with the practiced accuracy of someone who had learned which statements leave no graceful response. Nolan did not attempt one. He was watching the overhead camera, specifically the LED pulse on its housing, and the confirmation screen of the electronic table management system, and the delay between a card being dealt and the digital confirmation registering on the edge display. He was, as Eleanor realized when she looked at him carefully during the second intermission, not trying to win the first two rounds. He was building a map. She approached him during the break and asked what precisely he thought he was doing. He told her that if you want to identify who controls a room, you sometimes have to let them believe it is still theirs. He also told her to document the IP addresses active on the VIP floor network and note the timestamp on any outbound data transfer during the match, specifically any transfer to a server not registered in Nevada. Eleanor went to find the resort's network security log and a notary. The data Nolan had tracked was clear. The electronic table was relaying hand composition data to an external server in real time, and the server address, when he caught a partial trace on a display screen near the console, matched the IP block registered to Ashcroft Capital's operations division. He did not yet have documentation sufficient to halt the match, and under the terms of the agreement Vivienne had signed, withdrawing now would transfer his shares to her automatically. Vivienne called the poker round back into session with the energy of someone finishing a task rather than beginning one, and she pushed all of her chips forward before the cards had finished being dealt. The setup of the poker table took several minutes, during which Felix Ashcroft found his way to Nolan's end of the room and asked, with the studied casualness of a man making small talk at a wake, how a person who apparently held a legitimate claim to one of the most valuable private gaming licenses in the American West had spent 17 years maintaining other people's machinery. Vivienne, who had overheard, said she would genuinely like to know the answer, and said it in a tone that made clear she expected it to be embarrassing. Nolan gave a short answer, not because the full story was too painful, but because he had long ago learned that brevity is the only way to make an important thing land with the weight it deserves. His wife, Amelia, had been diagnosed with a degenerative neurological condition when Harper was not yet 2 years old. The board had asked him to stay and expand the brand into Arizona and Utah, and Gideon had told him, with genuine feeling, that opportunities like this came once. Nolan had looked at Amelia during a treatment session on a Tuesday afternoon and understood that some things only come once in a different way, and he had packed a car within the week. He had not sold his shares because Gideon had told him they would be waiting, and he had not come back to Las Vegas after Amelia passed because he had promised Harper that she would grow up somewhere where her father was never the most powerful person in the room, just the most present one. Ashcroft said the gaming industry was not a time capsule, and 17 years was 17 years. Vivian said that people who left the table had no claim on the pot when they returned. Nolan looked at her and said that people who did not know who had built the table probably should not assume they owned the room around it. This was the first time all evening that the laughter in the room did not come from her side. Not much. A few quiet exhales, 2 or 3 guests who looked at their shoes. But Vivian noticed because she noticed everything, and the noticing did something to her composure that Wexler's coaching had been designed specifically to prevent. Eleanor, who had returned from the network office with a printed log and a notary seal, quietly placed a document near Nolan's position and caught his eye for exactly 1 second. The document confirmed what Nolan had suspected about the server transfers, and it confirmed something larger. The data transfers from the VIP table network had begun not tonight, not 3 weeks ago when the Ashcroft deal was announced, but nearly 8 months earlier, 2 months before Gideon Blackthorne's hospitalization. The planning had been running while Gideon was still alive, still signing documents, still trusting the man who sat in the CFO's chair. Nolan processed this in the 2 seconds it took him to read the relevant section and set the document back down. And then he said 2 things. He asked that the electronic table be deactivated and replaced with a mechanical dealing shoe and a non-networked surface, citing the Crown Table Challenge's fair play provisions. And he asked that the current floor manager be replaced by resort security personnel, reporting directly to Eleanor. Wexler raised his voice for the first time all evening. Eleanor produced the relevant clause from the charter document. When the power cable to the VIP table's electronic management system was physically disconnected, Grant Wexler went the particular color of a man who has just watched a door he was certain was locked swing open on its own. Nolan looked at him from across the room, not accusatorially, just with the level gaze of a person who has confirmed the answer to a question they had been quietly asking since arriving, and said, to the room, that from this point forward, the only people who would know the next card were the 2 people sitting at the table. The poker session opened on a mechanical table that had been rolled out of a storage room and was almost certainly older than half the people watching it. It felt a shade of burgundy that had not been fashionable since sometime in the previous century. Its dealing shoe, a weighted aluminum model with no digital interface of any kind. It was, by every aesthetic standard of the room around it, an absurd setting for a contest that would determine the governance of a multi-billion-dollar organization. Nolan sat down at it the way he sat down at his workbench, back straight, hands resting, eyes open. He was no longer moving through the evening like a man trying not to attract attention. He was simply present in the way that settles over a person when they have stopped performing and started working. Vivienne was still a skilled player, and it would have been a mistake to forget it. She had the genuine gift of a mathematical mind layered over long conditioning in emotional control, and she could read faces with the accuracy that comes from years of conducting meetings, where the actual negotiation was always happening at a different altitude than the stated one. What she could not compensate for, in the absence of the signals she had been unconsciously relying on all evening, was an opponent who was not behaving according to any model she had been given. He was not aggressive. He was not meek. He did not flinch at large bets the way a player in his position was supposed to. He played each hand with the unhurried specificity of a man who understood that the cards were only one variable. He asked questions during play, not conversationally, but with the deliberate timing of someone who had identified exactly which questions would require Vivienne to use the part of her mind she needed for the game. He asked why Wexler had delayed the quarterly debt report by 6 weeks. He asked how Ashcroft's team had been able to model Blackthorn Crown's per-room revenue down to 2% variance when that data had never been made public. He asked who had authorized the creation of a subsidiary entity registered in Delaware 4 months before the partnership announcement. Each question was aimed not at Vivienne but at the air above the table, and each one required Wexler, standing beyond the glass, to either remain expressionless or produce a micro-expression of the kind that a person trained in systems analysis notices immediately. Vivienne began to look toward Wexler more frequently than she looked at her cards. Nolan won the first poker hand, and then the second. He set the $1 chip in front of Vivienne after the first win and said, without performance, that this was the price she had placed on a judgment before she knew his name. Nobody laughed. He gave her the chance to reconsider before the final hand. Not as a mercy, he said, but as a professional courtesy. If she agreed to delay the Ashcroft signing, submit the CFO's records to an independent auditor, and allow Eleanor to review the network transfer logs, the match could be suspended and both parties could walk away with their positions intact. Vivienne concluded the offer was tactical. She was right. She was wrong about which direction the tactic was meant to move. Eleanor had found the anomaly in the debt structure 8 minutes earlier and had confirmed it from 3 separate archive sources. Ashcroft moved toward the exit. Nolan mentioned, without raising his voice, that the terms of the signed agreement required all material parties to remain present until the match concluded, and that Ashcroft was listed on page 4 as a material party. Ashcroft stopped. Vivienne declared the final hand would be played for everything remaining, and Nolan agreed. Cock. The final hand was dealt from the mechanical shoe into a silence that had the specific texture of 60 people trying very hard not to breathe noticeably. Vivienne's cards came to her face down, and she left them that way for 4 seconds before lifting the edges. 4 seconds that told Nolan, with more precision than the cards themselves, that what she had seen had satisfied her. She set them down again with a controlled evenness almost but not entirely indistinguishable from the evenness of a person with nothing to hide. Nolan looked at his own cards once, briefly, placed them face down on the table, and did not look at them again for the remainder of the hand. Instead, he watched Vivienne's left hand, which rested near but not touching her chips in the way a hand rests when a player is confident but has been trained not to project confidence. He watched the half-millimeter shift in Wexler's shoulder beyond the glass, the shoulder of a man who could see the table from his angle and whose posture encoded in real time how much he wanted Vivienne to push forward with everything she had. Nolan understood what Wexler actually wanted from this hand. A total commitment of all chips and all shares into an irrevocable contract transfer. One that would survive even a subsequent investigation because both parties would have entered it voluntarily in front of witnesses. The documentation of wrongdoing could come later. A signed contract executed under legal supervision was considerably harder to unwind than a conspiracy that had not yet been fully performed. Nolan placed a bet deliberately calibrated to read as the bet of a player trying to protect a weak hand. Large enough to discourage casual opposition, small enough to suggest anxiety about a call. Vivienne read it as weakness. The room read it as weakness. Wexler's shoulder moved the way it moves when a mechanism has completed its function. Vivienne slid her entire chip stack into the center of the table with the composed finality of a woman ending a conversation. Before Nolan moved his chips, he looked at her and asked whether she was making this decision because she believed in her cards or because she could not tolerate the idea that someone she had dismissed might be right about something. She said she was making it because she had excellent cards, and the question was a last attempt by a frightened man to create doubt in someone who had none. Nolan said he hoped She was correct and moved his stack to the center. The cards came up in the order that mechanical shoes produce, without drama or ceremony. Vivian held a combination that would have beaten the majority of what Nolan could reasonably have been holding based on the visible surface. Nolan held a combination that cleared her hand by a single rank, a margin that was not luck, because luck is what remains when preparation has no more room to operate, and what had brought Nolan to this particular combination was the precise knowledge of how Vivian responded to mounting pressure across the preceding rounds, the pattern she displayed when she believed she was closing out a contest, and the specific behavior of her betting in the 40 seconds before she committed to a major move. He had known what she would bet. He had known roughly what she was holding. He had built the final hand around those two pieces of information and an old mechanical dealing shoe that could not be reached by anyone's server. Eleanor announced the result. The legal transfer language in the signed agreement was unambiguous. Vivian's 52% controlling interest passed to Nolan Vance, effective immediately, and in combination with his 34% founding stake, he now held authority over 86% of Blackthorn Crown's voting shares. Vivian sat very still in a way entirely different from the composed stillness she had maintained all evening, the stillness of a person who has reached a conclusion and is waiting for the room around them to catch up. Nolan pushed the $1 chip across the table toward her and said she might want to keep it, that she would want to remember the cost of a verdict made too early. Ashcroft demanded an independent review of the match and alleged collusion. Nolan said he welcomed the review because he knew what a full inspection of the evening's proceedings would document, and it was not collusion between himself and Vivian. Ashcroft announced, with the controlled urgency of someone delivering prepared remarks slightly ahead of schedule, that Blackthorn Crown had been operating in violation of its primary credit agreement for the past 6 weeks, and was now in technical default, a status that triggered, under the terms of the loan facility Wexler had arranged with Ashcroft Capital 18 months earlier, an automatic right of seizure over the resort's core casino operations, hotel assets, brand licensing agreements, and the land parcel on which the flagship property stood. The room registered this the way rooms register significant bad news, not with noise, but with a particular quality of compression. Vivian looked at Wexler with the expression of a woman who has just understood that the person she trusted with the keys to her house had been copying them for a year. Nolan asked Eleanor to transfer full administrative access to the company's governance system to his credentials, a process that required both Eleanor's legal authorization and the authentication code embedded in the founder's crown marker, which the system accepted with a soft confirmation tone no one in the room had heard before. He opened the financial dashboard on the nearest display terminal and reviewed it for roughly 30 seconds without speaking, and then he began explaining what he was looking at. Wexler had created 4 shell companies in the previous 14 months, each incorporated in states with permissive disclosure requirements, and had routed internal casino revenue through these entities in a way that reclassified operating profit as intercompany debt, making a solvent operation appear to be borrowing money it had already earned. The effect was a fraudulent liability of approximately $2 billion that existed entirely on paper and had been used to justify the loan covenant Ashcroft had written his seizure rights into. Wexler said this was a mischaracterization of a complex treasury strategy and that every transaction had been authorized at the executive level. He looked at Vivian when he said this. Vivian looked at the transaction log and saw her own digital signature on documents she had no memory of reviewing, affixed through an automated counter-signature protocol Wexler had implemented 18 months earlier under the premise of streamlining board approvals. She had signed it because it had been presented as an efficiency measure, and she had been trusting Wexler for 6 years. Nolan asked Eleanor to locate and activate the founding reserve fund, a financial structure Gideon had built in the company's 4th year, existing in a trust structure accessible only to a founding tier shareholder. The fund was not large enough to retire the fraudulent debt entirely, but it was more than sufficient to satisfy the technical default and buy the company 90 days of clean financial standing. Nolan activated it, which stopped the seizure clock. He then suspended Wexler's administrative credentials, placed a legal hold on all outbound asset transfers, ordered a forensic accounting review of every transaction Wexler had touched in the past 3 years, and instructed Eleanor to ensure the pension and payroll accounts for the resort's 3,800 employees were fully ring-fenced before any other action was taken. Wexler attempted to access the network from his phone and found his credentials had already been invalidated. The backup archive system, a redundant data structure Nolan had designed in the company's early years, overlooked during every subsequent technology update because no one else understood what it was, had captured a complete record of every transaction, every communication, and every server transfer that had occurred in the past 18 months. The archive was immutable. Ashcroft's name appeared in it 112 times, and the earliest entry predated Gideon Blackthorne's hospitalization by 2 months. Eleanor found the video file in the archived governance folder 40 seconds after she gained full system access, a dated recording, time-stamped to the week before Gideon's hospitalization, flagged for release upon detection of the crown marker at any Blackthorne crown table. The video played on the main display in the VIP lounge, visible to everyone still present. Gideon Blackthorne looked exactly as Vivian remembered him from the last year of his life, deliberate in his movements, precise in his diction, carrying the specific authority of a man who has stopped trying to seem powerful because he no longer needs to. He spoke directly to the camera without notes. He said that if this recording was playing, someone had presented the founder's crown marker at the crown table, and the contingency he had been dreading had arrived. He confirmed, clearly, and with the legal phrasing of someone who had prepared the statement with counsel, that Nolan Vance was a co-founder of Blackthorne Crown in the full meaning of that term, that the risk management architecture, the licensing strategy, the anti-fraud detection system, and the expansion model that had made the company what it was had been developed jointly, and that the 34% founding stake had been granted not as compensation or generosity, but as ownership, because Nolan had built half of what stood around that room. Gideon said he had not told Vivian about Nolan because he had hoped she would learn a particular lesson before it became necessary to learn it from him. The lesson that the name on a building and the mind that built it are not always the same, and that the quality of a leader is measured not by what they inherited, but by whether they can recognize what they do not know. He said he had failed to create the conditions for her to learn this lesson before he ran out of time, and he said this without self-pity. He said he had become aware of the approach by Ashcroft Capital, and that he had detected in Wexler's behavior a pattern of divided loyalty he could not yet prove but could not ignore. He had sent the founder's crown marker to Nolan because Nolan was the only person he trusted to be both disinterested in personal gain and competent to stop a sophisticated financial conspiracy. Two qualities that are rarely found together and almost never found in the same person who also has the legal authority to act on them. Gideon said the right outcome would be determined by what happened at the crown table, and that he trusted the table to produce a result that the boardroom could not have arrived at on its own. He looked directly at the camera for the last 3 seconds and said nothing further, and the room stayed quiet in the way it stays quiet when something final has just been spoken in it. Vivienne did not cry because she was not a person who cried in front of audiences, but she produced the silence of someone who would have cried in another context. The image of her father that had structured her entire adult life had not been false. Gideon had been everything she believed him to be. But it had been incomplete in a specific and significant way. And the incompleteness made her feel the way you feel when you have been reading a map correctly, but discover the map was missing an entire region. She turned to Nolan and asked directly, not as a challenge, not as an apology, but as a genuine question, whether he intended to remove the Blackthorn name from the properties. Nolan said he had not driven to Las Vegas to dismantle anything, and that 3,800 people who had shown up to work that morning were not responsible for the decisions made by those above them. He said the name was not his concern. The foundation was. He looked at her steadily and said, "Your father left you a name. He left me the responsibility of protecting what that name used to stand for." Then he turned to Eleanor and told her to prepare the documentation for transfer to the Nevada Gaming Control Board. The formal restructuring of Blackthorn Crown's leadership took 3 weeks to execute. Wexler was removed from his position on the second day, his credentials permanently revoked, and his access to every company system sealed under a litigation hold that Eleanor had prepared with the thoroughness of someone who had been waiting to do exactly this work. Ashcroft Capital withdrew from all negotiations within 72 hours of the forensic audit beginning, citing a desire to allow the company's new leadership to operate without external pressure, a statement that impressed no one in the industry who read it and fooled no one who hadn't. The regulatory investigations that followed were conducted by agencies with more patience and more authority than Ashcroft was accustomed to encountering. Nolan was confirmed as controlling shareholder and chairman of the board, a title he accepted on the condition that the organizational structure beneath it be reconfigured to distribute operational authority more broadly across department leadership. He offered Vivienne Blackthorn 3 specific conditions under which she could retain her role as chief executive officer. She would submit the company's finances to an independent auditor on a quarterly basis with no ability to delay or modify the review. She would eliminate the incentive compensation structures that rewarded senior leadership for cost reductions, resulting in workforce reductions. And she would operate for 6 months without the operational exceptions and deference protocols that had historically applied to the founder's family, evaluated on the same performance criteria as every other executive in the company. Vivienne accepted all 3 conditions without negotiation, which told Nolan, who had expected at least a counter on the second point, that the events of the previous week had produced in her a quality of self-reflection that had not been available before. She apologized to Nolan in front of the board members and the guests who had witnessed the evening's events. She did not offer a lengthy explanation or contextualize the apology inside a justification. She said she had evaluated him based on what he was wearing and where he lived, and had used that evaluation to treat him in a way that was not defensible, and that she was sorry. Nolan did not ask for the apology and did not perform any visible emotion about receiving it. He said he appreciated it and moved on to the next item on the agenda. He continued to live in Henderson and kept Vance Restoration open on the days he was not at the Blackthorn Crown offices. 6 months later, the company reported its strongest quarterly performance in 4 years, and the press release ran under a joint byline listing Vivienne Blackthorn as Chief Executive Officer and Nolan Vance as Chairman. Harper was in the room when the scholarship fund for the children of resort employees was announced. A fund endowed from the restructured executive compensation pool, and she stood near the back and watched her father accept the applause with the specific discomfort of a man who finds recognition more awkward than adversity. Vivienne no longer introduced Nolan as a mechanic. At the quarterly earnings presentation, she said the words that cost her the most to say, and that she meant without qualification, that he was the man who had built Blackthorn Crown twice. In the renovated VIP lounge, a small glass display case was mounted near the entrance to the Crown table room. Inside it rested a single $1 gaming chip, and the placard beneath it read, "The most expensive judgment in Las Vegas was made for $1." Nolan walked past it on his way out of the building on the evening of the fund announcement, paused for the length of a breath, and did not stop. He had a truck waiting in the parking structure and a daughter who had sent 3 messages in the past hour, and the night air outside the casino smelled like desert and distance and everything that had nothing to do with chandeliers. He had walked into Blackthorn Crown that night as the man no one recognized, wearing a grease-stained uniform, holding a worn copper coin, asking only to deliver a warning, and he was leaving exactly the same way. Without announcement, without ceremony, and with no particular interest in being watched on his way out of the building he had built twice and had never once needed to put his name on.